In Lower Manhattan, there is a kind of silence that money buys. Not the silence of peace, the silence of control, the kind that settles when a decision has already been made, before anyone asks permission to remember. In 2015, during utility work near the old waterfront grid, ground that has been cut, filled, rebuilt, and sealed over for centuries, a crew opened a cavity that wasn't supposed to exist. The records called it fill, the street called it foundation, but what they found did not behave like debris, it behaved like intent. A timber-lined pocket packed tight as if someone had built a small room inside the earth and then tried to forget they ever needed it. Inside were fragments that should not have survived if they were truly accidental, damp paper fused into brittle layers, iron hardware corroded to the shape of restraint, and wood marked with shallow cuts that looked like initials. Letters pressed into grain the way a desperate person presses proof into something that can't testify back. This is where the story always begins. Not with a discovery, but with a shutdown. The order was immediate. Stop. Step back. No photos. No personal notes. Call it in. The language was modern. Procedures. Protocols. Sensitivity. Yet the effect was ancient. The same choreography used whenever the ground threatens to speak. Within hours, the site was controlled, the pocket was emptied or covered, and the work resumed as if nothing had happened. The public version becomes a line item. Delay due to unforeseen conditions. The private version becomes a warning. Do not pursue this. You might ask what a few scraps could possibly mean in a city built on demolition. But that question only works if you accept the official premise that what lies beneath Wall Street is just old stone and old water. The receipts disagree. And the receipts, when they are allowed to exist, tell you something more frightening than a single hidden room. They tell you the room had a purpose. They tell you it belonged to a system. They tell you the system was not a side story to the rise of finance. It was the training ground. Before there were stock tickers, there was an opening price for a human being. New York in the 1700s was not merely a port, it was a processor. People entered the city as cargo and left the city as assets. Not metaphorically, legally. In the ink of bills of sale and auction notices, in the clipped vocabulary of merchants and brokers, a person becomes a unit. Prime. Sound. Likely. Wench. Boy. Negro man. Not a name. Not a life. A specification. A price. A predictable output that can be bought, leveraged, insured, and replaced. And if you think that sounds like the language of markets, that is because it is. The system did not have to invent cold abstraction. It practiced it. It practiced it on bodies. Here is what the city learned early. A market is not just a place where things are bought. A market is a place where violence is converted into paperwork so that respectable men can profit without touching the blood. The genius, if we are going to name it honestly, was administrative. Build a chain where everyone performs a clean task. A clerk records. A broker arranges. A notary certifies. An underwriter calculates risk. A constable enforces. No single hand feels like the executioner. And yet the machine works only because someone is being broken to make the numbers balance. That is why the discovery under the street matters, because it threatens the illusion that all of this was elsewhere, that Wall Street was merely an innocent stage and slavery was merely an inconvenient backdrop. That is the story we were sold, that finance rose from ingenuity, not from inventory. But the buried record, what survives in ledgers, advertisements, policies, claims, shows a different origin story. It shows modern finance learning its earliest habits from the sale of human beings, how to standardize value, how to distribute risk, how to secure collateral, how to liquidate loss. And there is a reason those fragments beneath the street trigger panic. Because if the ground yields artifacts, it forces a second question, a more dangerous one. What else was placed here, and why did it need to be sealed? To answer that, you have to understand what Wall Street originally meant, beyond the myth. It was not just a symbol of wealth, it was an ecosystem of contracts. An ecosystem needs inputs, and in the 1700s and 1800s, one of the most efficient inputs was a human being turned into property. Property that could be sold quickly, pledged for credit, insured against loss, and hunted when it tried to escape. The receipts do not whisper this. They state it plainly, in the unemotional tone of commerce. An auction notice lists a person the way a modern listing describes a commodity. Age, skill, temperament, defects. A runaway advertisement describes a face as if it were a stolen instrument. Scars, teeth, gait, clothing, anything that helps recovery. An account ledger converts a day of labor into a fraction of a dollar while converting a person's body into a balance sheet asset. And then, the most revealing documents of all, insurance records and claims, proof that suffering was not only anticipated, it was priced. When you can insure a person, you have already accepted that the person is not a person. You have accepted that the person is a risk-bearing object whose destruction can be compensated in cash. This is the logic that built the modern world, the conversion of human life into a financial instrument. A life becomes collateral, a future becomes a cash flow, a death becomes a claim. And once you see that, you start to recognize the pattern of silence, not as embarrassment, but as maintenance. Because telling the full truth would require rewriting the origin story. It would require acknowledging that financial innovation did not begin with elegant speculation. It began with an uglier talent, the ability to assign a number to a human being and treat that number as more real than the human. So when a cavity opens under the city and yields iron and paper and initials pressed into wood, the machinery reacts the way it always has. It does not ask, what is true? It asks, what is exposure? It asks, what is liability? It asks, who must not see this? That is why the first command is always the same. No photographs, no notes, no story. Because memory is the one asset that cannot be controlled once it is distributed. Let me be precise about what I am accusing here. I am not accusing the past of being immoral. That is too easy, and it lets the present off the hook. I am accusing institutions, then and now, of understanding exactly what they were doing and constructing systems designed to erase the human cost while preserving the profit. I am accusing them of building an archive that remembers transactions and forgets victims. I am accusing them of turning the absence of names into policy. Because the most telling feature of these records is not what they contain. It is what they do not contain. The men financing and insuring these lives are named. They have addresses. They have reputations. Their correspondence survives. The people being bought and sold are reduced to descriptors and then vanish. A first name appears once and never again. A payment continues, though the person disappears from every subsequent line. The ledger stays balanced, the body does not, and that is the horror. Not a single crime in the dark, but a lawful, daylight system where disappearance can be recorded without consequence. This story is not about finding one secret room. It is about recognizing why the city keeps making rooms like that, literal or bureaucratic, spaces where the unmentionable can be stored out of sight. A sealed cavity under a street is simply a physical version of what the paperwork has done for centuries. Contain the truth, strip out the names, and move on. But we are not moving on. Over the next hour, I am going to show you how Wall Street, New York in the 1700s and 1800s, became a site where humans were priced at open market, where the port's warehouses and pens functioned as processing points, where advertisements and auctions taught the public to read a person as a product, where insurance and credit normalized the idea that a body could secure a loan, and where the habits of modern finance, standardization, liquidity, risk distribution, collateralization, were rehearsed on people who were not allowed to be people. And if that makes you uncomfortable, keep that discomfort. Do not dilute it into trivia. Do not convert it into interesting history. The moral obligation here is simple: to refuse the comfort of forgetting, because forgetting is not neutral. Forgetting is an endorsement of the mechanism that produced the silence in the first place. You were taught that Wall Street is a story about money. It is. But money is only the surface. Underneath, there is a deeper ledger, and it begins with a price placed on a human life, an opening price, set in a city that trained itself to call that normal. You already know the official story, because it is the only version that gets repeated without resistance. Wall Street is framed as a triumph of order, merchants replacing chaos, contracts replacing violence, institutions replacing uncertainty. A thin myth of progress, a story about trade, enterprise, liquidity, growth. The city congratulates itself for inventing the modern economy, and then it stops talking. It stops right at the moment where the receipts begin to implicate it. Because if you follow the paper honestly, the origin of modern finance in New York is not clean. It is not neutral. It is not merely business. It is an ecosystem that learned, early, how to turn a human being into an asset and then pretend the transformation was natural. The textbooks treat slavery like a southern gravity that New York merely orbited, but the receipts show proximity. The receipts show participation. The receipts show design. The receipts show that the market did not just tolerate slavery. It trained itself on slavery, and it learned lessons that still structure how wealth moves. This is the first thing you have to accept if you want to see clearly. A market is not a moral vacuum. A market is a choice, repeated until it becomes culture. Wall Street did not simply emerge. It was built, legally, administratively, and socially, by people who understood that pricing a person required more than cruelty. It required paperwork. It required enforcement. It required a public that could watch an auction and call it commerce. It required institutions willing to protect the transaction and ignore the human cost. And when we say institutions, we do not mean a single villain. We mean a network of clerks, brokers, notaries, constables, magistrates, warehouse keepers, ship captains, and underwriters, each performing a small task, each able to say later that they only handled documents, only moved cargo, only wrote a policy, only followed procedure. This is how violence survives in polite societies. It is split into steps until no one feels responsible for the whole. So let's lay the two stories side by side, the story you were taught and the story the receipts insist on telling. The official narrative says Wall Street is about abstract value, the rise of credit, the pricing of risk, the invention of securities, the neutral machinery of capital. The missing narrative says Wall Street is also about literal value, bodies priced at open market, human lives treated as collateral, loss converted into claims, suffering converted into a risk model. The official archive celebrates the sophistication of contracts. The human archive remembers what those contracts were built to contain. The official archive keeps the names of financiers. The human archive fights to keep the names of the disappeared. And it is in that gap, between what is recorded and what is lived, that the horror takes shape. Because the gap is not a mistake. The gap is policy. Listen to the language the records prefer. They do not say kidnapped. They say acquired. They do not say cage. They say secure keeping. They do not say beaten. They say corrected. They do not say family separated. They say sold. They do not say died. They say loss. This is what bureaucratic violence looks like, a vocabulary built to erase your empathy while preserving the transaction. And the most important part is this: that vocabulary is not accidental. It is crafted. It is repeated. It becomes the grammar of legitimacy. When you can describe a human being as a line item, you can do almost anything to them and still sleep at night, because the paperwork will tell you it was normal. This is why the phrase buried record matters here, not because the truth is unknowable. The truth is knowable in fragments. It is knowable in receipts. It is knowable in the way separate documents, written by separate hands for separate purposes, still align into the same pattern. What is buried is not the evidence. What is buried is the willingness to name what the evidence means. Institutions do not fear facts in isolation. They fear conclusions. They fear the moral sentence that follows the data, because the moral sentence creates obligation, and obligation is expensive. Now, I want you to hold on to one principle as we move forward. The economy that emerged in New York in the 1700s and 1800s did not grow in spite of human commodification. It grew through it, not as a footnote, as a training ground. The methods we associate with modern finance, standardizing value, transferring risk, using collateral to unlock credit, turning uncertainty into profit, these methods did not begin as sterile innovations. They were sharpened in a market where the underlying asset could scream. And to understand how that happened, you have to start where the city started, with a project. Not a single building, but a project of governance. A project of making trade enforceable. A project of transforming a port into a disciplined machine that could process goods, debts, and people with equal efficiency. By the early 1700s, New York was expanding as a commercial hub. The port mattered, the docks mattered, warehouses mattered, courts mattered, and crucially, the law mattered, avoiding sentiment, enforcing ownership. In 1711, New York authorized a formal slave market on Wall Street, near the East River, an official place to buy and sell human beings in public. Not hidden, not informal, authorized. That alone should rupture the myth that slavery was merely peripheral to New York's identity. This was not a secret vice. This was municipal commerce. The city did not just allow it. The city organized it. It created the space where bodies could be inspected, priced, and transferred like goods. A market does not appear by accident. A market is an endorsement stamped into geography, and once you have that market, you need the supporting infrastructure that makes it profitable at scale. You need credit, because many buyers will not pay full price in cash. You need documentation, because ownership must be legible to courts and creditors. You need enforcement, because the asset can run away. You need storage, because people are held before sale, after purchase, or during disputes. You need shipping, because bodies are moved between ports like commodities. You need insurance, because commerce fears loss, and slavery, like any system built on violence, produces loss constantly, through illness, injury, resistance, and death. This is the part most audiences are not trained to notice. The financialization begins the moment a person can be used not only as labor, but as a financial lever. When an enslaved person can secure a loan, the body becomes collateral. When that collateral can be seized or sold to satisfy debt, the body becomes a liquidatable asset. When a merchant can insure a ship and its cargo, including enslaved people, the body becomes an insured interest. When claims are paid for lost human property, suffering becomes a compensated event. That is not simply cruelty, that is a financial architecture. And it grows because it is useful. It grows because it creates predictable revenue streams for owners and predictable fees for intermediaries. It grows because it teaches institutions how to profit from risk without absorbing moral responsibility. You can see the elegant solution in the paperwork. Reduce a person to a set of variables that can travel across documents without carrying the weight of humanity. Age, sex, strength, skill, soundness, temperament, defects, price. The city's commercial class did not need to invent these categories from scratch. They inherited them and refined them. They made the human legible to the market, which is another way of saying they made the human manageable to exploitation. This is what a system does when it wants to scale. It standardizes, and once it standardizes, it can securitize, it can collateralize, it can insure, it can lend, it can foreclose. By the late 1700s, New York's financial institutions were consolidating into recognizable forms: banks, brokers, exchanges, underwriters. In 1792, brokers signed the Buttonwood Agreement, a foundational moment in the creation of what becomes the New York Stock Exchange. This is the official milestone people celebrate, the moment the city formalizes trading practices and commissions. But do not let the ceremony distract you. A system does not suddenly become moral when it becomes formal. Formality often exists to protect power. The same city that could formalize an exchange could formalize a human market. The same culture that could obsess over the enforceability of securities could obsess over the enforceability of ownership in flesh. These are not separate stories. They are parallel competencies, and this is where the record becomes almost obscene in its clarity. The paper trail that built respectable finance is the same kind of paper trail that built respectable slavery. Commissioning memos, procurement notes, correspondence, inventories, receipts, settlement ledgers. People think horror lives in shadows. But in this story, horror lives in filing systems. Now we come to the workforce, the human side that the records are designed to blur. Because it was not only the enslaved who were traded. Enslaved people also built the city's daily function, unloading ships, hauling goods, working in homes, constructing, cleaning, serving. They were hired out, leased, pledged, worked until broken, replaced. And the way they appear in the paperwork is the first crime of erasure. They appear as categories, not as full persons. Often a first name, often no surname, often just a label and a price. Meanwhile, the men who profit, merchants, brokers, owners, are recorded in full, anchored in networks protected by addresses, reputations, and partnerships. The record itself becomes an inequality machine. It preserves the identities of those with power and smears the identities of those without into anonymity. This is why I am going to insist on names whenever the receipts allow them, not because names are sentimental, but because names are evidence of personhood. A name is a refusal of the category. It is a declaration that the asset was a human being. And when the archive denies names, it is not merely being incomplete demonstrating, it is performing the same violence the system depended on. Silence is not absence. Silence is a decision. Here is how the language of erasure works in practice. A privileged man is esquire, merchant, captain, partner, director. He is described by his social weight, as if the paper must protect him from being mistaken for ordinary. An enslaved person is described by utility: able, likely, handy, stout, good cook, good seamstress, healthy, sound. Even the word sound is revealing. It is the language of livestock. It is the language of property inspection. And soundness is not a neutral term. It is a way to translate a living body into a warranty claim. If the person is not sound, the buyer expects a remedy. The human is reduced to a product whose suffering becomes a defect. To humanize what the system refuses to humanize, the receipts sometimes give us brief silhouettes, micro-portraits that exist only because someone needed to sell, recover, or claim. A woman listed for sale with her child mentioned as an attachment, a detail offered not to honor motherhood, but to shape the buyer's calculation. A skilled man hired out repeatedly, his labor turned into a predictable cash flow for an owner who does not work. A young person described with identifying scars in a runaway notice, proof that the system expected resistance and built an enforcement market around it, monetizing capture with rewards and advertisements. Each micro-portrait is not a full biography. It is a wound-shaped outline, and the paper is the knife that made it. And behind these portraits sits the pattern that tells you this was not random cruelty. It was organized. People appear once in a ledger and then vanish. Lines are crossed out. A name is replaced by a number. Payments continue while the person disappears from the visible record. The balance sheet remains tidy. The human record breaks. This is what financial systems do when they want continuity without accountability. They preserve the flow of money and disrupt the trace of bodies. You should not underestimate what it means for a city to normalize public auctions of human beings. It trains the public to watch, to accept, to participate, and then to forget. It trains clerks to write without flinching. It trains brokers to speak in euphemism. It trains underwriters to price risk without naming the violence creating the risk. It trains courts to treat human disputes as property disputes. It trains police to treat escape as theft. And once those habits are trained, they do not vanish when laws change. They migrate, they rebrand, they find new assets, new categories, new populations to reduce into risk and value. This is why I refuse the comforting idea that this is merely a story about a bad past. The past is not on trial because it cannot be punished. What is on trial is the practice of forgetting, because forgetting is still alive. Forgetting is how institutions continue to benefit from origins they will not admit. Forgetting is how a city can pave over a market in people and then call itself the cradle of freedom. Forgetting is how a nation can praise innovation while refusing to tally the bodies that financed it. And there is another reason the missing story stays missing. Because the receipts do not only document transactions, they document competence. They show how early financial actors learned to structure deals around human collateral. They show how risk was distributed across parties, how defaults were handled, how losses were absorbed, how enforcement was outsourced, how reputation was protected. In other words, they show that the brutality was not incidental, it was operational. It was built into the system's reliability. And reliability is what markets worship. So when you hear Wall Street described as a monument to rationality, remember what rationality meant in the receipts. It meant the rational conversion of a life into a price. It meant the rational calculation of whether a body was sound. It meant the rational distribution of risk so that no single party had to feel the moral weight. It meant the rational erasure of names so that the archive could preserve profit without preserving shame. We are going to proceed with the receipts as our guide, because they are the most damning witnesses precisely because they do not intend to be. They were not written to confess. They were written to operate. That is their value as evidence. A sermon can be dismissed as opinion. A ledger is a confession of practice. And I will repeat the rule that must govern this entire investigation. When you can price a human being, you are not merely describing the world. You are authorizing a world. The people who built that authorization in New York did not do it once. They repeated it until the city's wealth could rely on it. Our responsibility now is not to perform shock and move on. Our responsibility is to remember with precision, to name what happened, to refuse the comfort of myth. Because the dead do not get to argue with the archive. Only the living can do that. The paperwork will never tell you what it smelled like. It will never tell you what it felt like to be held in a city that called itself civilized, while it ran a market in people within walking distance of its courts, its churches, its counting houses. The record is built to preserve transactions, not suffering. But you can still reconstruct the conditions, because cruelty has operational requirements. If you are going to treat human beings as movable property in a port city, bought, sold, hired out, stored, shipped, seized, then you need places to contain them, rules to manage them, and routines to dispose of what the system cannot profitably maintain. Those routines leave traces, not in confessions, in logistics. Start with the waterfront because the waterfront is where bodies entered the city's accounting. Lower Manhattan in the 1700s and early 1800s is crowded, wet, cold in winter, stifling in summer, and saturated with disease. Ships bring in goods, passengers, and contagion. Dock work crushes hands and breaks backs. Warehouses trap heat, rats, damp, and rot. Crowded lodging turns minor illness into outbreaks. The city's own civic vocabulary, quarantine, inspection, restraint, exists because people were constantly being moved and concentrated in ways that made sickness predictable. In a system like this, an enslaved person is exposed to the worst layers, the dirtiest work, the tightest quarters, the least medical attention, and the swiftest discipline, because discipline is cheaper than care. The ledger's calm language, allowances, maintenance, loss, isn't neutral. It is the cost structure of human disposability. Look closely at what the records do say when they are forced to acknowledge daily reality. They talk about clothing allotments, food rations, days lost to sickness, payments reduced for incapacity, replacements requested when labor fails. They refer to soundness, which is a polite word for the brutal truth that the market demanded bodies that could endure. They refer to defects, which is a polite word for injuries, chronic illness, trauma, pregnancy, and exhaustion. The market's obsession with sound bodies is not incidental. It is admission. It tells you the system expected bodies to break and therefore built an inspection culture to manage the breaking. That is how commodification works. It turns suffering into a variable. And then there is discipline. The archive rarely calls it violence. It calls it correction, control, recovery, secure keeping. But the runaway advertisements, those cold public notices, betray the truth. They describe scars, missing teeth, branded marks, limps, and other traces of punishment and hard labor. These are not decorative details. They are proof that the city ran an enforcement economy. It paid rewards for capture. It normalized pursuit. It trained ordinary people to recognize human beings as fugitive property. A society does not do that accidentally. It does it because it has committed to the idea that escape is theft, and that a human being can be owned loudly enough to justify violence in the street. Now add the outsider voices, the fragments that slip through because not everyone wrote like a merchant. A minister's moral unease, a visitor's comment about auctions, about pens, about the casualness of inspection. A court dispute that accidentally describes the holding conditions because someone is fighting over who bears the loss. These voices are often brief and compromised, but they matter because they confirm what the transactional record tries to conceal. Human beings were not simply exchanged. They were handled. They were confined. They were transported through spaces designed for containment. And those spaces were not theoretical. They were built, rented, guarded, and managed as part of the city's commercial routine. Every system like this has incidents, moments when the machinery produces too much visible damage to ignore. Fires in crowded buildings, disease spreading through concentrated quarters, storms that flood low-lying storage areas, industrial accidents that injure workers the market considers replaceable. The key is not that the incident happened. The key is how the paperwork responds. When tragedy hits the privileged, the record becomes descriptive. Names appear. Cause is detailed. Responsibility is debated. But when tragedy hits the disposable, the record collapses into euphemism. The event becomes unfortunate. The outcome becomes loss. The response becomes no further action. This asymmetry is not just immoral, it is evidentiary. It shows you whose suffering mattered enough to be recorded as reality and whose suffering was treated as an accounting adjustment. And this is where the story turns from harsh conditions to something more chilling, the first vanishings. Because once you accept that human beings were processed through contracts, you have to confront the most dangerous question in any bureaucratic system of exploitation. What happens when a person stops being profitable, stops being visible, or stops being convenient? The record has an answer, but it hides the answer in patterns. Not a single dramatic sentence. Patterns. You see a person appear in a sale notice, then appear again in a rental arrangement, hired out for wages paid to someone else. And then suddenly, the person is absent. Not freed, not dead, not moved with clear destination, just absent. The money trail continues. The owner's financial activity continues. The labor demand continues. But the person disappears from the visible thread. If you want to understand institutional horror, understand this. When a system can make a person disappear without disrupting the cash flow, it will. Disappearance becomes efficiency. The ledger anomalies are the fingerprints, a line crossed out, a name replaced by boy or wench, as if individuality is interchangeable, a notation like sent away without a follow-up, a reference to care that never results in a return, a sale noted without the buyer recorded or recorded somewhere else the public does not access. Wages paid for labor that continues, while the worker's identity is swapped like a worn tool. This is how you learn to read for erasure, not by looking for dramatic language, but by watching continuity of profit paired with discontinuity of personhood. And then there is the most revealing mechanism, substitution. When a person is hired out, insured, pledged, or otherwise financially instrumentalized, their absence creates a problem only if it threatens someone else's money. That is the rule. If the owner loses a person but can replace them cheaply, the paperwork often goes quiet. But if someone else has a financial stake, if a creditor expects collateral to exist, if an insurer faces a claim, if a renter has paid for labor promised, then the archive becomes briefly honest because money demands proof. In those moments, you get the language of evasion, not to be found, supposed to have gone, taken ill, lost, disposed of, words that admit disappearance while refusing accountability. Consider what it means, structurally, to use a human being as collateral. It means the body is tied to a debt instrument. It means the creditor can demand the asset if the borrower defaults. And it means that a person's fate becomes a line in a dispute between institutions. Foreclosure is not just a property action in this world. It is a human action. Seizure is not just the taking of goods. It is the taking of a life. If you want to find the hidden violence of finance, you look at enforcement mechanisms. Who is empowered to seize what, and what includes. Now add insurance, the coldest proof of all. Insurance is a technology of risk transfer. It allows profit to continue even when loss occurs because someone else absorbs the financial shock. When insurance logic is applied to enslaved people, the moral boundary has already been crossed and fortified. The body becomes an insurable interest, and death says less about grief than about payout. The claims culture trains institutions to ask the wrong questions, not what happened to the person, but was the loss covered? Not was there cruelty, but was there negligence? Negligence in this setting does not mean harm to a human being. It means harm to a financial expectation. That inversion is not an accident. It is the system's operating principle. So the vanishings begin to look less like mysterious accidents and more like expected outcomes managed through bureaucracy. People are sent away, and the record does not care where unless a bill demands it. People are replaced, and the record treats replacement as repair. People are listed once and never again, and the record expects you to interpret silence as neutrality. But silence here is not neutral. Silence is the method by which the system protects itself, because a complete record would create account. Account would create responsibility, and responsibility would threaten legitimacy. This is where I need to be explicit about the moral duty in front of us. When you read these patterns and shrug, when you accept that a vanished name is simply an archival gap, you are doing the institution's work for it. You are helping the machine complete its task, converting a human life into an untraceable cost. The least we owe the erased is to refuse the convenience of that shrug. To treat a crossed-out line as a wound, not a clerical flourish. To treat a missing follow-up as a deliberate absence, not a harmless omission. Because what vanishes first in a system like this is not the body. It is the obligation to explain the body. And remember the timeline the city prefers to celebrate. New York likes to point to gradual emancipation laws and eventual abolition in the early 1800s, as if a date on paper dissolves a system built across generations. But the very existence of gradualism is a confession. It managed freedom like a controlled release of assets. It prolonged ownership under new terms. It protected property claims while congratulating itself for progress. That is what institutional morality looks like when it is engineered to preserve wealth, change the language, preserve the advantage, and keep the archive respectable. So when you see the vanishings, when the ledger swaps a person for a category, when payments continue without a name, when sent away becomes a period at the end of a human life, You are not witnessing a random failure of documentation. You are witnessing a system that learned how to lose people on paper while keeping profit intact. That is not history drifting. That is history being managed. And if you are tempted to ask, how many vanished, understand what that question threatens. Because the answer would not just indict individuals, it would indict the city's commercial identity. It would expose that the same streets that host the mythology of modern finance also hosted the routine liquidation of human lives. It would turn Wall Street from a symbol of abstract markets into a crime scene of priced bodies. And that is why the record is fragmented. That is why the discovery under the street triggers shutdown. That is why silence repeats across centuries. Not because the truth is too complex, because the truth is too direct. The next step is to follow the pattern into its most concentrated window, the period when the city's need for labor, credit, and control spikes, and the vanishing stop looking like anomalies and start looking like throughput. Because once the machinery is built, it does not stay idle. It scales, it accelerates, and it leaves receipts that cannot be mistaken for coincidence. There is a moment in every machinery of exploitation when it stops pretending to be stable. The public story calls it a crisis. The receipts call it something else: a spike in demand, a spike in losses, a spike in replacements, a spike in enforcement. And when the spikes arrive, the system reveals what it really is. Not a series of isolated cruelties, but a coordinated throughput model that expects people to be consumed. In New York, the late 1700s into the first decades of the 1800s are full of pressure points that compress time and raise the temperature of everything. War cycles, shipping disruptions, financial panics, disease seasons that turn crowded waterfront districts into incubators, and political tremors that make the powerful obsess over control. In an honest city, crisis forces compassion. In a commercial city built on commodification, crisis forces optimization. The question becomes, how do we keep commerce moving when bodies, human bodies, are breaking faster than they can be replaced? You see the answer in the paperwork when the volume changes. Not because someone writes, "We are in a peak window of human consumption." They never write that. They write what a system always writes when it is under strain. More orders, more requests, more complaints, more transactions. Letters intensify. Notices multiply. Wanted ads proliferate. Notices of sale cluster. Hiring arrangements become shorter, harsher, more transactional, as if even the pretense of long-term custody is inconvenient. The language tightens, the empathy disappears, not because it was ever there, but because the crisis strips away even the performance of restraint. And the city's geography matters here. Lower Manhattan is a hinge between shore and street, between ship and warehouse, between public commerce and private containment. When trade surges, bodies surge with it. Sailors, dockhands, coerced labor, hired out enslaved workers, the invisible human infrastructure that makes a port look prosperous. When disease surges, yellow fever seasons, cholera fears later, recurrent outbreaks in crowded districts, the city responds with quarantine logic: isolate, remove, contain. In a humane society, quarantine is about protecting life. In a society that already classifies certain lives as property, quarantine becomes another mechanism of disappearance. A person can be removed for health and never reappear in the visible record. The word sounds responsible. The outcome is still absence. This is how the system learns to create restricted spaces without calling them prisons. A shed, a cellar, a secure room, a yard, a house behind a respectable facade, a holding area near the docks that no one advertises as a cage because the city prefers the language of logistics. The receipts do not need to name these places directly to reveal them. They reveal them through indirect necessity. If auctions occur, people must be held before and after. If disputes occur, people must be secured while ownership is contested. If shipping occurs, people must be staged like cargo. If illness occurs, people must be separated. Containment is not a rumor in a system like this. It is an operational requirement. Now add war pressure. When the War of 1812 disrupts Atlantic commerce and throws the port economy into volatility, the city's merchant class says the same thing every merchant class says when its margins are threatened: enforce property, reduce loss, secure capital. Wartime is not only a battlefield, it is a legal and financial atmosphere that intensifies the obsession with control. The poor become suspicious, the displaced become risky, the enslaved become a security problem, which is the language a system uses when it is afraid that people it has dehumanized might reclaim humanity by force. And in those windows, when fear rises, when rumors spread, When policing hardens, runaway ads and enforcement measures stop being occasional. They become routine. The city normalizes pursuit the way it normalizes interest payments, as a background hum of commerce. There is also the pressure of ideology. The Haitian Revolution, beginning in 1791 and culminating in independence in 1804, sends shockwaves through every slaveholding society in the Atlantic world. You don't need a dramatic proclamation in New York's receipts to see its effect. You see it in heightened anxiety about insurrection, in more aggressive containment, in more aggressive surveillance of black communities, in a tightening of the social leash. The powerful do not write, "We are terrified." They write policy. They write enforcement. They write restrictions. And when the system tightens, people vanish more efficiently because the social environment becomes more hostile to their visibility. This is the peak window logic. Multiple pressures converge: commerce, disease, war, ideological fear, and the result is predictable. Requests for labor rise. Tolerance for disruption falls. Bodies are treated as consumables. If someone breaks, replace them. If someone runs, hunt them. If someone sickens, remove them. If someone dies, record a loss. Keep the machine moving. Always keep it moving. I wish I could tell you this part is speculation. It isn't. Because the receipts are consistent across categories that have no incentive to coordinate demonstrating. Sale notices, hiring records, enforcement ads, insurance language, court disputes. Independent documents align into the same operating picture, not a single shock anecdote. A system. And in a system, you can locate the moment where the ledger starts behaving differently. This is where disappearance becomes a measurable anomaly instead of an occasional mystery. It's not that people didn't vanish earlier, it's that during peak windows, the vanishings cluster and the paperwork begins to show strain in the form it cannot hide, substitutions and urgency. You see more crossed-out lines, more abrupt terminations of entries, more sent-away notes without returns, more transactions that resolve financially while leaving the human element unresolved. The ledger becomes what it always was, a tool to preserve profit while allowing the human trail to dissolve. There is a particular kind of ugliness in how the system manages scarcity. After 1808, when the United States formally bans the importation of enslaved people from abroad, the market does not become moral. It becomes more internal, more lucrative, more reliant on domestic supply chains, more dependent on the ability to convert existing bodies into finance. When you cannot easily import new inventory, the pressure to extract more from the existing inventory rises. That means more hiring out, more mortgaging, more collateralization, more insurance, more aggressive recapture, more forced movement through domestic trade routes. Scarcity does not end exploitation, it intensifies it. That is how markets behave when the underlying asset is a human being and the moral constraint is absent. This is the moment the story stops being about abstract structures and becomes about a dangerous question with legal weight. When someone with money wants proof, because as long as the loss falls only on the enslaved, the record can stay quiet. Silence is cheap when no one powerful is harmed by it. But when disappearance threatens the accounts of people who have leverage, owners, creditors, underwriters, renters, heirs, silence becomes costly, and cost forces documentation, not complete truth, but enough truth to defend the institution's position. This is where the confrontation letters begin, the paper fights that reveal what the system admits only when cornered. These letters are not written by abolitionists. They are written by people who accept the system and are angry not at slavery, but at uncertainty. They do not say, "Where is the man because he is a man?" They say, "Where is my property because I paid for it?" And that is precisely why they are damning. Because they show the system's internal accountability. Human life matters only when it is tied to someone else's money. A creditor wants to know whether the collateral exists. A renter wants to know why the hired labor never arrived. An insurer wants the cause of loss and the chain of custody. An executor wants to locate assets for an estate inventory. An owner wants a refund, a replacement, or a certificate that converts disappearance into an acceptable entry. The demand is always the same in function: produce the body or produce paperwork that will substitute for the body. And this is where institutional language becomes a weapon. The response letters and notes do not provide clarity. They provide defensibility. They use vague categories designed to close disputes without exposing operational detail. Taken ill. Sent away for care. Not recovered. Supposed to have gone. Could not be found. Believed to have escaped. Disposed of. The genius of these phrases is that they admit nothing verifiable while implying inevitability. They create a narrative of unfortunate events rather than a system of managed disappearance. They are written to survive court, not to honor truth. Pay attention to the speed with which institutions respond when money is impatient. That speed tells you what they are capable of when they choose to be. When ordinary people ask for the truth, the institution delays. When a creditor asks for proof, the institution produces a document. When an underwriter asks for details, the institution supplies a cause framed as compliant. When an owner threatens legal action, the institution suddenly becomes polite, urgent, and administratively generous. This is how you identify the real hierarchy of concern, not by what is said publicly, but by what triggers action privately. In these confrontations, you see small admissions slip through the cracks, not because the institution grows honest, but because it must protect itself from liability. A letter implies the person is dead, but refuses to specify where or how. A note acknowledges that the person was moved off-site, but offers no destination. A settlement is offered without an explanation, which is itself an explanation. When you pay quickly to end questions, you are purchasing silence. The institution may call it resolution. In moral terms, it is hush money written in the handwriting of bureaucracy. And then, inevitably, there is the demand for certification. This is one of the most chilling aspects of a commodified society, the need to convert human absence into a legitimate financial event. Death certificates, burial records, affidavits, documents that, in a humane world, serve memory, are used here as tools of accounting. The question is not, how do we mourn? The question is, how do we close the books? The body becomes a problem to be documented, not a life to be honored. Even grief is subordinated to ledger logic. The confrontation letters also reveal something else: the system's dependence on controlled ambiguity. If the institution explained too much, it would create patterns that could be traced. A precise admission becomes a precedent. A detailed explanation becomes discoverable. A named location becomes a site that could be investigated, so the system cultivates vagueness. Vagueness is not ignorance, it is protection. Vagueness keeps the public from forming a coherent picture. Vagueness keeps the archive fragmented. Vagueness keeps the machine running without a map that could be used against it. This is why I keep returning to the phrase, silence as policy. It is not a poetic device, it is a procedural reality. Silence is the default, and speech is rationed only when leverage demands it. The system does not hide because it is ashamed. It hides because it is functional. It hides because transparency would create accountability, and accountability would interrupt profit. And this is where the moral responsibility becomes unavoidable. If you inherit wealth, institutions, and civic pride from a city that perfected this kind of paperwork, you do not get to treat the story as mere historical atmosphere. Because the techniques did not vanish with legal changes, they evolved. The ability to convert suffering into a risk calculation. The ability to distribute responsibility across multiple actors so no one feels guilty. The ability to treat human outcomes as externalities. These are not relics, they are habits. And habits are the true inheritance of systems. So when we read these confrontations, when we watch money demand proof and institutions respond with controlled vagueness, we are not reminding ourselves that the past was cruel. We are exposing how cruelty becomes administratively survivable. We are exposing how a society can run a market in people and still call itself enlightened, because it learns to keep the horror inside documents that most people will never read, and then to bury the rest, literally, under streets that carry the name Wall Street, as if the wall was only ever stone. And notice the grim symmetry. The only time the archive becomes briefly legible is when someone powerful risks a loss. That is the indictment. That is the moral stain written in ink. The system's conscience is not awakened by human saying. It is awakened by financial exposure, which means the human cost is not merely ignored, it is engineered to be irrelevant. The peak window does not end the story. It sets the stage for the next mechanism. How the system formalizes its silence into procedure, how it learns to make erasure scalable, and how later generations discover the residues, then repeat the same decision to seal, reclassify, and move on. But before we go there, you need to hold one truth in your mind with full weight. When the crisis came, the city did not become more humane. It became more efficient. And the receipts prove it, not through a dramatic confession, but through the administrative rhythm of a machine that never stopped converting people into paper. Once a system has survived its first scandals, its first outbreaks, its first visible eruptions of cruelty, it does not repent. It professionalizes. That is the real evolution of institutional violence. It becomes procedural. It learns which phrases protect it, which documents must be separated, which records must be lost, which discoveries must be controlled, which questions must be framed as inappropriate. The public imagines a cover-up as a dramatic conspiracy. The receipts show something worse. A cover-up as ordinary operations embedded in policy, performed by people who will swear they are merely doing their job. Silence becomes a procedure long before it becomes a headline. It begins in the vocabulary. The system trains itself to speak in euphemisms that do not invite investigation. Removal, disposition, secure keeping, correction, loss. These words are not descriptors, they are shields. They do two things at once. They acknowledge an event and deny moral content. They let the ledger close while keeping the conscience open-ended. And in any institution that depends on respectability, open-ended conscience is invaluable. It allows future generations to claim ignorance. It allows modern heirs to say, "We don't know," even when the structure of not knowing was engineered. Then silence becomes architectural. The record splits into layers: a public ledger and a private ledger, a clean book and a dirty annex, a summary page that looks harmless and a set of attachments that never make it into the archive. You see missing pages. You see discontinuities in numbering. You see references to "see attached" with no attachment preserved. You see entries that imply another book existed. You see gaps that are too regular to be accidents. This is not the chaos of time. This is the pattern of management. Because a system that wants to survive cannot allow a single continuous paper trail from human pricing to human disappearance. Continuity creates accountability. So the system fragments itself on purpose. It creates a paper maze. Enough documentation to enforce ownership and collect profit, not enough to create a count. Silence also becomes bureaucratic. When someone asks questions that threaten legitimacy, the institution does not always deny. Denial is risky. Denial invites proof. Instead, it uses delay, deflection, and jurisdiction. No record located. Outside our purview. Records destroyed. Not retained. Confidential. Proprietary. These are modern terms, but the logic is old. The logic is the archive exists to serve power, not truth. The archive is not a museum of conscience. It is a tool of governance. And in the age we are describing, 1700s into 1800s, governance includes the governance of human property. Silence becomes social too. Not everyone needs to be threatened. Many only need to understand the boundaries. Clerks learn what not to write. Warehouse keepers learn what not to describe. Constables learn which names to treat as disposable. Underwriters learn which risks to quantify and which causes to ignore. Judges learn to treat a human dispute as a property dispute. Pastors learn which sermons are safe. Journalists learn which stories will be punished. The institution does not need a single order if it can cultivate a culture. Culture is cheaper than coercion and more effective. A culture of silence outlives any individual. That is why systems persist even after laws change. The habits remain. And now we reach the most revealing proof that silence became procedure, the way bodies and evidence are handled when they surface. Because even if paper can be manipulated, the ground is less obedient. You can burn documents. You can omit names. But physical remnants have a way of returning, especially in a city like New York, built on reclamation, landfill, demolition, reconstruction. Lower Manhattan is not stable earth. It is layered decisions. Each generation builds on top of the previous one and calls it progress. But when you dig, progress can look like concealment. That brings us to the second discovery, the one that happens later, in another decade, under another administration, with the same instinctive response. Jump forward 30, 50, 80 years. The dates change, the departments change, the language becomes more professional, but the choreography repeats. A renovation, a survey, a repaving, a foundation repair near the old waterfront. Workers find a sealed void, or a concealed room, or artifacts stored where they should not be stored. They find iron fittings that do not match ordinary building hardware. They find timbers arranged like containment. They find fragments, bone, cloth, metal, mixed into fill in a way that suggests dumping rather than accident. Sometimes they find paper, because paper, when sealed away from light and air, can survive long enough to implicate the living. Here is what happens next, and it is always the same. Control the site, control the narrative, control the evidence. Sensitive, historical, hazard, private property, do not disturb. In older language, it might be improper, inconvenient, liable. In modern language, it becomes risk management. But the effect is identical. The discovery is not treated as a moral emergency. It is treated as a reputational threat. And because institutions learn, the second discovery is often handled more efficiently than the first. The area is resealed quickly. The items are removed without public cataloging. The workers are told to forget what they saw. If anyone tries to keep a souvenir, it becomes theft. If anyone tries to photograph, it becomes violation. The institution enforces silence not with dramatic intimidation, but with policy and payroll. Most people comply because most people have bills to pay. That is how silence scales. What makes the second discovery so important is not only what is found, it is what is repeated. When a society makes the same choice across generations, to reseal, to rebury, to reclassify, it reveals the continuity of interest. The past is not simply forgotten, it is actively managed as a liability. The institution is telling you, without words, that the truth is still dangerous. If it were merely old history, it would be safe. Museums would display it, plaques would describe it, tours would monetize it openly. But when the response is containment, you are looking at a wound that still threatens to bleed into the present. And in these later decades, there is often a single person who breaks procedure, not by staging a rebellion, but by committing the smallest act of moral defiance. They keep a record. A clerk copies a page before it disappears. A surveyor sketches what they saw. A laborer memorizes the markings. A junior official writes a private note because something in them refuses to accept that human evidence should be treated as debris. This is how truth survives in bureaucratic systems, in petty acts of conscience that the system cannot fully predict. These private records are rarely heroic in tone. They are often plain. That is what makes them credible. They sound like someone trying to prove to themselves they did not hallucinate. They note dimensions. They note locations. They note that someone in authority ordered resealing. They note the exact phrase used. They note the time pressure. Within hours. They note the prohibition. No photographs. They note the reason given. Sensitive. Sometimes they note an object with initials carved into wood, letters that look like someone trying to preserve identity when the city refused. A person, reduced to property in life, tries to preserve personhood in the grain of a plank. That plank then becomes the institution's problem decades later because it refuses to be fully assimilated into fill. And here is the moral pivot you must not miss. When we talk about cover-up, people imagine a decision made after wrongdoing, but in this story, the cover-up is part of the wrongdoing. The system is designed from the beginning to generate deniability. It treats bodies as assets and treats evidence as waste. It builds an archive that is detailed about profit and vague about harm. It creates procedures that normalize disappearance. Then, when physical remnants threaten to expose the human cost, it applies the same administrative skill to bury the proof. The cover-up is not an add-on. It is the maintenance function of the machine. That is why the language of the record matters so much. It is easy to be outraged at violence. Outrage is natural, but outrage fades. What does not fade is procedure. Procedure is what turns a moment of cruelty into a durable system. Procedure is what allows people to say generations later, we didn't know, even though the entire architecture of not knowing was carefully built. Procedure is what allows modern finance to claim clean origins while sitting on foundations that were paid for with priced bodies. So when you hear silence as policy, do not imagine a single gag order. Imagine 1,000 small choices that all point in the same direction. Do not name, do not count, do not connect, do not excavate, do not publish, do not disturb. Imagine the institutional instinct to treat truth like contamination. It must be contained, it must be quarantined, it must not spread. And now the question becomes unavoidable. If the ground has been sealed more than once, if discoveries have been reburied more than once, if the archive has been fragmented on purpose, then what exactly is being protected? Not just reputation, not just tourism, not just a brand, something more fundamental, the legitimacy of origin. Because if the city admits, fully, with detail, that some of the foundational competencies of modern finance were perfected through the commodification of human beings, then the story changes. It becomes impossible to say this is just history. It becomes impossible to pretend that wealth is innocent simply because it is old. It becomes impossible to enjoy the benefits without inheriting the obligation. And that is the obligation I am placing on the table now, without apology. You do not get to inherit the language of markets, assets, liquidity, risk, collateral, without confronting the first place those concepts were sharpened in this city. You do not get to celebrate innovation while refusing to name the bodies that paid for the early experiments. You do not get to walk the streets of Lower Manhattan and treat the ground as neutral when the ground has been asked, repeatedly, to keep secrets. The second discovery is not a twist. It is confirmation. It confirms that the system of erasure was not a one-time historical accident. It was a pattern. And patterns are what prosecutors look for because patterns prove intent. Patterns prove that the same decision was made again and again. Protect the institution, not the dead. Protect the ledger, not the names. Protect the story, not the truth. And the most damning part is how small the moral choice would have been. A public inventory, a transparent report, a memorial with names reconstructed from fragments, a refusal to treat human evidence as nuisance. These are not technically impossible acts. They are morally inconvenient acts, which is why they are avoided. Because the institution's instinct is not to remember, the institution's instinct is to endure. So we move forward with this in mind. The cover-up mechanism is not the absence of information. It is the presence of a system that knows exactly what it must do to keep information from becoming knowledge. And the second discovery shows that even when the earth tries to speak, the institution has rehearsed how to make it quiet again. After the second discovery, the institution does what it always does when it cannot fully erase. It outsources the truth into private hands. This is how a respectable society survives its own evidence. It allows research, but only on terms that keep the conclusions small. It allows publication, but only if the names remain scattered. It allows memory, but only if memory stays inconvenient and personal, never consolidated enough to become an indictment. So the story shifts from public space to private archive. Not because the truth becomes softer, but because the fight becomes quieter. A box in an attic, a folder in a desk drawer, a stack of copied pages kept by someone who understood that official custody means official editing. In the 19th century, and then again in the early 20th, you can find the same pattern across serious investigations of institutional harm. A researcher gathers fragments that, when assembled, change the meaning of the whole. The institution responds not by disproving the fragments, but by controlling the assembly. Because the power is not in a single receipt, the power is in the pattern the receipts create when they are allowed to meet each other. A serious researcher does not begin with outrage. They begin with cross-referencing. They match an auction notice to a court filing. They match a bill of sale to a shipping route. They match a runaway advertisement to a jail return. They match a name in one ledger to an initial carved into wood. They match a date of loss to a season of outbreak. They do what institutions hate most. They connect. Because connection collapses plausible deniability. Connection turns isolated incidents into a machine. Connection turns a city's mythology into a prosecutable timeline. But the private archive is not romantic. It is a triage unit. It is incomplete by nature because it is built from what the official archive refused to preserve. The researcher is always arriving late, always reconstructing after damage, always reading around the holes. And yet, those holes themselves become evidence. Missing page numbers, references to attachments that do not exist, a ledger index that points to a volume not held in public collections, notations like "see separate book" with no separate book available. This is where the researcher learns the most brutal lesson. The archive is not broken. The archive was built to break exactly where it would become morally dangerous. Then comes the institutional pushback. It rarely arrives as a straightforward threat. It arrives as a gate. Access is delayed. Permissions are narrowed. Important documents are suddenly under conservation, misfiled, restricted, unavailable. Funding gets conditional. Partnerships are offered with quiet strings attached. A publication opportunity appears with a polite clause. Remove that section. Soften that claim. Avoid naming living institutions. Avoid connecting finance to human commodification too directly. The researcher is not told, do not tell the truth. They are told, be responsible. And responsible, in this context, means responsible to the institution's comfort, not responsible to the dead. You can almost hear the institutional voice because it is always the same. We support scholarship, but we value balanced perspectives, but we cannot endorse speculative claims, but this is how power talks when it wants censorship to look like professionalism. It does not argue against the receipts. It argues against the interpretation. It tries to isolate each fragment so it cannot form a narrative. It tries to keep the researcher in the posture of inquiry, tentative, hesitant, endlessly qualifying, because that posture is safe. What the institution fears is the posture of revelation, because revelation implies obligation, and obligation implies restitution, and restitution implies cost. And here is the hinge where many researchers break, not out of cowardice, but out of exhaustion and dependency. Because institutions control resources, access to archives, funding for travel and copying, credibility through affiliation, publication channels, professional survival. The researcher is told implicitly or explicitly that a certain level of truth will be tolerated and rewarded, and a deeper level of truth will be punished or buried. So the compromise is made. The book is published with gaps. The article appears with softened language. The public narrative becomes complex, nuanced, contested, even when the receipts are consistent. The institution gets what it wants, the appearance of transparency without the consequence of confession. But truth does not vanish completely, it relocates. The missing chapters remain in a private box. The researcher keeps photocopies. They keep notes. They keep a draft with the sharper sentences intact. They keep a list of names reconstructed from fragments, names that would never appear together in an official publication because together they would form an accusation. The private archive becomes a moral act, not heroic, not loud, but stubborn, a refusal to let the institution own the story completely. And this is the tragedy. Truth exists, but it is scattered by design. The city's victims are dispersed not only physically through sale and shipment, but historically through documentation. Their names do not appear in a single dignified register. They appear in hostile documents, sale notices, capture rewards, insurance claims, court disputes. To reconstruct them is labor. It is grief work performed across centuries, and the institution benefits from that labor being difficult. Difficulty is a defense mechanism. If remembrance is exhausting, fewer people will do it. If reconstruction requires expertise and time, fewer people will attempt it. If the burden is on the public to prove harm beyond doubt, the institution can wait out interest. That is how erasure survives, by making memory expensive. Now we move forward into the modern era, and you might expect the logic to change. You might think, surely, with technology, with audits, with imaging, with professional ethics, the system would finally admit what it did. But modern institutions do not abandon old instincts, they upgrade them. They learn new ways to say the same thing, and nowhere is that clearer than in the modern technical report, the document that pretends to be neutral while it quietly replicates centuries of avoidance. In the late 20th century and into the 21st, the city begins to study itself with instruments that do not care about reputation. Ground-penetrating radar, structural scans, environmental assessments, subsurface imaging, construction surveys that map what lies beneath before foundations are poured. These reports are written in a language that sounds clinical: anomalies, voids, disturbances, inconsistent fill, subsurface features. The words feel safer than grave or pit or sealed chamber, but the meaning can be the same. The report identifies irregularities that cannot be explained by ordinary building history. It notes concentrations where the ground behaves differently. It marks zones where excavation is not recommended. It flags areas as sensitive. And then comes the most important line in the modern era, the line that proves continuity. We recommend against excavation. We recommend no disturbance. We recommend avoidance. Not because the evidence is weak, but because disturbing it would create obligations the institution does not want to carry. This is how modern power operates. It chooses risk management over moral repair. It chooses legal containment over historical truth. It chooses do not disturb, because disturbance would turn anomaly into evidence and evidence into responsibility. Notice the continuity of language across centuries. In the 1700s, silence was enforced with direct authority and social control. In the 1800s, it was maintained through fragmented archives and edited publications. In the modern era, it is justified through compliance and sensitivity protocols. The system learns to make avoidance look ethical, out of respect, to prevent harm, to avoid disruption. These phrases can be true in some contexts, but in this context, they can also be convenient because respect without disclosure is not respect. It is containment, and containment is what the institution has always preferred. This is the point where people try to escape into cynicism. They say, that's how history is, we can't change it. That response is another form of erasure. Because we are not talking about changing the past. We are talking about refusing to let the past be used as a shield for the present. We are talking about whether institutions that benefited from human commodification are willing to name it fully, to count it as far as the receipts allow, and to accept that memory is not optional when wealth was built through dehumanization. The modern technical report is not just a document about the ground, it is a document about institutional character. It tells you what the institution does when it has enough information to suspect the truth but not enough courage to confront it publicly. It tells you whether the institution's first instinct is to reveal or to manage, and again, the pattern repeats: manage, avoid, contain, because the institution's primary loyalty is to continuity. Continuity of reputation, continuity of operations, continuity of narrative. And that is where the moral duty returns, sharper than before. If the official archive fragments the truth, the private archive must connect it. If the modern report says, "Do not excavate," we must ask, is that a statement of care or a statement of fear? If the system continues to treat human evidence as sensitive in a way that prevents public knowledge, then the sensitivity is not for the dead. It is for the living who inherited the benefits. The dead are not harmed by truth. They are harmed by being forgotten. So understand what is happening here. The institution has perfected a strategy across time. It permits knowledge in pieces, but it forbids knowledge in total. It allows the public to see fragments, but it blocks the assembly that would reveal the machine. It tolerates curiosity, but it punishes conclusion. And it relies on our fatigue, our willingness to accept that the story is too complex, too old, too contested, too inconvenient to fully face. But complexity is not an excuse for silence. Age is not an excuse for amnesia. Inconvenience is not an excuse for moral failure. The receipts, auction notices, runaway ads, insurance language, debt instruments, court disputes, and the modern maps of anomalies are not asking for our entertainment. They are imposing a responsibility to remember with precision, to name what was done, and to refuse the comfort of a clean myth. Because if we cannot even honor the dead with truthful memory, then the institution has won twice, once by commodifying them in life, and again by erasing them in history. We are near the end now, which is the point where most narratives try to soothe you. They offer a clean resolution, a lesson delivered like a product, a final turn toward comfort. This story does not permit that, not because hope is forbidden, but because false closure is another kind of erasure. The institution has spent centuries perfecting the art of unfinished truth, enough detail to function, not enough to indict. If we end the same way, soft, vague, grateful, we will have obeyed the very procedure we just exposed. So we will end the only honest way, by separating what can be proven from what can be inferred, and then naming what remains unknown not as mystery, but as the result of choices. Because the unknowns in this story are not natural fog, they are engineered darkness. Here is what we can prove without asking anyone to believe anything. We can prove that in New York, in the 1700s and into the 1800s, human beings were publicly traded as property, priced, inspected, and transferred through formal documentation. We can prove that the city's commercial ecosystem depended on paperwork that reduced people to specifications, age, skill, soundness, and price. We can prove that enforcement was monetized through runaway advertisements and rewards, meaning the city normalized pursuit of human property as routine commerce. We can prove that credit instruments and estate settlements treated enslaved people as liquidatable assets, property that could be pledged, seized, inherited, or sold to satisfy debts. We can prove that the language of risk and loss applied to these bodies in ways that foreshadow modern financial logic: value standardized, risk managed, uncertainty priced. We can prove that the archive disproportionately preserves the identities of those who profited while fragmenting the identities of those who were exploited. And we can prove that fragmentation is not merely time's decay. The record shows discontinuities, missing attachments, references to separate books, and a consistent preference for euphemism over clarity whenever harm would become morally legible. That is the base layer. It is enough to convict the myth. It proves that Wall Street's origin story is incomplete on purpose. It proves that modern finance did not rise in a vacuum of abstraction. It rose in a city that practiced abstraction on human beings first. Now, here is what we can infer with high confidence because multiple independent traces point the same direction even when they were not designed to agree. We can infer that the marketplace required containment infrastructure, holding spaces near the docks and commercial districts, because transactions and shipments cannot function without staging. We can infer that illness, injury, and punishment were frequent and systemically managed through administrative language, because the record repeatedly frames human breakdown as loss, defect, or removal, and because enforcement documents describe bodies marked by violence and deprivation. We can infer that disappearances were not rare anomalies but operational outcomes during peak pressure windows, war disruptions, disease seasons, economic volatility, because the volume and urgency of transactions and enforcement measures intensify, and because the paperwork shows substitution patterns, a human identity dissolving while money continues to flow. We can infer that when evidence surfaced physically, artifacts, sealed voids, concealed materials, the institutional reflex was containment rather than disclosure, because that reflex is consistent with the logic already visible in the archive. Reveal only what is necessary to protect the system and bury the rest. We do not need to pretend certainty where certainty is not available, but we also do not need to pretend ignorance where the pattern is obvious. Courts convict on patterns all the time when the pattern is consistent and the incentives align. The incentives here align perfectly. Profit demands documentation. Reputation demands silence. The archive is the compromise. Now here is what remains unknown and why. We do not have a complete list of names because the system was structured to deny full personhood in its paperwork. We do not have complete counts because counting would have converted a moral atrocity into a measurable liability. We do not have complete burial maps or detailed disposal records because physical evidence creates obligations, legal, moral, financial, that institutions are trained to avoid. We do not know the full extent of the concealed spaces under the city, because urban development repeatedly sealed and overwritten the past, and because when anomalies were detected, the dominant recommendation was often avoidance rather than excavation. These are not simply lost to time. They are lost to policy. They are lost to deliberate incompleteness. And that brings us back to the beginning, the discovery under the street and the order that follows. Stop. No photos. No notes. Sensitive. Reseal. If the past were truly over, those orders would not still appear. If the system's beneficiaries were truly confident in their moral story, they would not need containment. The persistence of containment is itself evidence of guilt. So what does a responsible ending look like in a story where institutions refuse responsibility? It looks like this. We name the moral truth without hiding behind neutrality. The moral truth is that institutional reputation and financial continuity were protected at human cost, and then that protection became a skill, a civic tradition. The city learned to convert bodies into assets and then convert evidence into silence. The techniques that make markets powerful, standardization, collateralization, risk transfer, were not born clean. They were tested and refined in a system that treated people as property. And the residue of that origin is not merely historical. It remains in the habits of institutions, what they count, what they disclose, what they classify as sensitive, what they recommend against disturbing. Now we finish with the only thing the institution could never fully erase, the human refusal to vanish. Even when names are missing, traces persist. Initials carved into wood are not decoration, they are protest. They are a person declaring, in the smallest possible medium, I existed. A runaway notice is not merely a tool of recapture. It is inadvertent testimony that the enslaved resisted, that they fled, that the system was never as stable as it pretended. A crossed-out line in a ledger is not merely clerical. It is the mark of a human life being administratively erased. The silence that follows is not mere absence. It is an active decision to let that erasure stand. This is where the moral responsibility transfers, because it always transfers. The dead cannot correct the archive. The erased cannot subpoena their own history. Only the living can do that. Only the living can decide whether the receipts remain scattered or become a coherent indictment. Only the living can decide whether sensitive means protected from harm or protected from accountability. Only the living can decide whether a city built on priced bodies will continue to treat memory as optional. So here is what I am asking you to do, and I am not asking gently. Do not consume this story as entertainment. Do not treat it as an atmosphere. If you take anything from this, take the obligation to remember with precision. When you hear Wall Street, do not hear only stocks. Hear the earlier market. When you hear insurance, do not hear only prudence. Hear the logic that learned to price human loss. When you hear collateral, do not hear only security. Hear the bodies that were used to secure debts. And when you encounter the comfortable myth that New York's wealth is a clean inheritance of innovation, refuse it. Demand the full ledger. Because there is a final horror in this story that is easy to miss. The institution does not need you to agree with it. It only needs you to forget. Forgetting is the cheapest form of cooperation. Forgetting is how the machine remains intact even when the facts are available. Forgetting is how the dead are killed twice, once in life and again in history. So we will not forget. We will not call this complexity and move on. We will not hide behind the convenience of distance. The receipts are here. The patterns are here. The missing pages are here. The sealed spaces are here. The moral conclusion is here. A city that learned to price people helped build the modern world's financial grammar. That grammar still shapes whose lives are treated as assets, whose suffering is treated as risk, whose disappearance is treated as acceptable loss. If you are listening from somewhere far from New York, do not assume distance means innocence. This system was not local. It was exported, in ships, in contracts, in laws, in habits of thought. Comment where you're from, not as a gimmick, but as a reminder that the ledger traveled. And if you have seen the same euphemisms in your own archives, different era, different victims, same administrative calm, say so. Because the most dangerous lie an institution can tell is that its violence was unique, finished, and safely buried. The ground under Wall Street was asked to keep secrets. The archive was trained to forget names. The city was trained to call it normal. We are not obligated to inherit that training. We are obligated to break it. 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 We are obligated to break it.